While we are going to be casting votes on an issue of enormous consequence, and that is whether we reappoint Ben Bernanke as chairman of the Fed. And I'm here to argue that that would be a very bad decision, that we should reject this nomination, that we need in this country a new Wall Street which understands that its function is not simply to make as much money as it can for extraordinarily wealthy people on the street, but to begin to integrate the functions of Wall Street into our productive economy, make credit available to small and medium-sized businesses so we can break out of this horrendous recession which is causing so much pain from one end of this country to the other. And in order to create a new Wall Street, we need a new Fed. And we need a new Fed chairman who is going to provide new leadership. The same old is not going to work. Madam President, everybody in America agrees and understands that a little over a year ago, our nation, in fact, the world's financial system, came to the edge of a major collapse, And Madam President, everybody also understands that the function of the Fed is to protect the safety and soundness of our financial institutions. That is its main function. Can anybody deny with a straight face that the Fed and its chairman, Mr. Bernanke, failed at its task? They failed. This is not a personal attack against Mr. Bernanke. But while Wall Street became converted into the largest gambling casino in the history of the world, where was Mr. Bernanke and the Fed, whose job is to protect the safety and soundness of our financial institutions? They weren't there. And it seems to me to be a very bad idea to reward somebody with reappointment who failed at an enormously important task which has driven this country into a severe recession, so that 17% of our workforce today is either unemployed or underemployed. Millions of our fellow Americans have lost their homes, they've lost their savings, they've lost their ability to send their kids to college, they've lost their hopes for the future. Mr. Bernanke failed at his job. He should not be rewarded with reappointment. Further, Madam President, many of us, after 8 years of the Bush administration, we said it is time for a change. It is time to change the priorities of this nation, time to move us in a new direction. The evidence is overwhelming that from an economic perspective, as well as many other perspectives, the Bush administration failed. Let me quote from the Washington Post earlier this month. And this is what they said about the Bush economy. Quote, "The past decade was the worst for the U.S. economy in modern times. It was, according to a wide range of data, a lost decade." Let me repeat, a lost decade for American workers. There has been zero net job creation since December 1999. Zero. Middle-income households made less in 2008 when adjusted for inflation than they did in 1999. End of quote. A lost decade. Standard of living for American workers down. Creation of wealth down for American workers. Ben Bernanke was not only appointed by George W. Bush to be chairman of the Fed, Madam President, he was a member of the Bush administration. In fact, he was the chairman of President Bush's Council of Economic Advisors. Why do you want to reappoint somebody who not only failed at his job as chairman of the Fed in terms of protecting the safety and soundness of our financial institutions, but was an architect of the Bush economy, which was a disaster for American workers. Madam President, we need a new direction at the Fed. And it's not only looking back at the failures of Mr. Bernanke, it is looking forward and saying, how can the Fed respond to begin to protect the middle class and working families of our country? And here's something that has not been discussed enough. The Fed today has enormous powers. Now, many will remember that as part of the bailout, Mr. Bernanke and the Bush administration not only pushed for a $700 billion bailout for Wall Street, but on top of that, Mr. Bernanke provided trillions of dollars, let me underline that, trillions of dollars in zero-interest loans to large financial institutions. As a member of the Budget Committee, I had the opportunity to ask Mr. Bernanke which financial institutions received those trillions of dollars. I don't think that's an unreasonable question on behalf of the American people. And Mr. Bernanke said, in so many words, sorry, Senator, not going to tell you. The American people don't have to know who received trillions of dollars of their money. That, to me, is totally unacceptable. We need transparency at the Fed, and Mr. Bernanke has not provided that transparency. I have introduced legislation to bring that transparency to the Fed. Somebody whose views are very different than mine on many issues, Ron Paul in the House, brought forth similar legislation. We need transparency. We need a chairman of the Fed who will give us that transparency. And that's something that Mr. Bernanke can do tomorrow. Madam President, in my state of Vermont, and I'm sure in your state of New York, people are calling you every single day, and they are saying, we are sick and tired of paying 25 or 30% interest rates on our credit cards from the same banks and bunch of crooks that we bailed out who got us into this recession in the first place. Now imagine that. You have people who act on Wall Street in a reckless, irresponsible, illegal way. Taxpayers bail them out, and they say, thank you, taxpayers. By the way, we're going to raise your interest rates on your credit cards. Have a nice day. All over America, people cannot believe, they're outraged that this is happening. Well, you know what? Mr. Bernanke and the Fed have the authority today to lower interest rates on credit cards. They could do that today, and that is what they should do, because one of their responsibilities is to protect consumers against outrageous and fraudulent activities. And in my view, charging people 25 or 30% is outrageous and fraudulent and usurious. Madam President, all over this country, the President mentioned it last night, appropriately so, all over this country, small and medium-sized businesses who are making a profit are crying out for low-interest loans in order to expand their businesses and to hire new workers. One of the great economic problems we're having as a nation, the President touched on it last night, is the need for small, productive businesses to get the low-interest loans they need. Well, Mr. Bernanke was there with zero-interest loans for large, failed, fraudulently, dishonestly run Wall Street firms, but he ain't there for small businesses all over this country who desperately need low-interest loans. The Fed has the authority today, not tomorrow, today, to provide low-interest loans to small and medium-sized businesses so that we can begin to hire new workers and bring our economy out of the severe recession that we are currently in. Madam President, the reason as I understand it, that the taxpayers of this country, against my vote, I should say, were asked to bail out the crooks on Wall Street was because they were too big to fail. You see, if a small business goes under, that's okay. Somebody's worked his whole life building the business, fails, no problem. We don't help them. But if you're a big, large financial institution and you engage in reckless, illegal behavior, we bail you out because if you go down, you're going to take a large part of the economy with you. You're too big to fail. Well, many of my colleagues might be surprised to know that 3 out of the 4 largest financial institutions in this country that we bailed out because they were too big to fail are bigger today than they were before we bailed them out because they were too big to fail. Now, that may make sense to somebody, not to this United States senator. It seems to me that what common sense suggests is that we break up these large financial institutions so, A, that the American people are never again put in the position of having to bail them out because they're too big to fail, and second of all, that we begin to understand what Teddy Roosevelt understood 100 years ago, is that that concentration of ownership is dangerous for the economy. Today, you have 4 major banks who are providing 2/3 of the credit cards in this country. 4 major financial institutions, 2/3 of all the credit cards. You have 4 major financial institutions who are writing half the mortgages in America. That's wrong. Break up the large financial institutions, as we talked about all over the world. Bernanke has the ability to begin to do that tomorrow. I have not heard one word from him to suggest that he will do that. Madam President, the American people are angry. The American people are frustrated. And what they are angry and frustrated about is that in many instances, they are working longer hours for lower wages than they used to if they are fortunate enough to have a job. The American people are frustrated and angry because this immediate financial crisis and severe recession was caused by the recklessness and irresponsibility of a handful of people on Wall Street. And the American people are frustrated and angry because they are not seeing the kind of accountability and change in terms of the activities on Wall Street that they expect and demand to happen. Quite the contrary. After having bailed out people who acted in an illegal and irresponsible way, what they are seeing is Wall Street pumping millions of dollars into campaign contributions and lobbying so that we can bring them back to where they were before the bailout. The American people want change in the way our financial institutions run. The American people want change at the Fed. And I believe the American people want a new chairman or chairwoman at the Fed. Now is the time to say to the American people, we hear you. We are going to bring about change. We are going to deny the reappointment of Bernanke as chairman. We are going to ask President Bush to give us a new nominee who is going to stand up for the middle class and working class of this country rather than for the big money interests on Wall Street. Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and with that, I would yield.